Too.
afternoon, friends and newcomers to our Friday special conversations with special people. I'm so happy to have as our special guest today a great professor and a great friend. He's a very dear friend who has donated so much of his time and talent to our library community since 2004. And he has spoken here at least twice a year, most more often than that even. When someone cancels out, I know who to call. He's wonderful, and he always has something intelligent and brilliant to say. Besides being a professor of English at Seton Hall, he sends out a daily poem, and it started out. John, you want to just say how it started out?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Thank you, Phyllis. Yeah, it was around this time last year when they said it was like the year anniversary of places beginning to shut down because of the COVID pandemic. It's hard to believe it's been a year, and it's been quite a year. So really just completely on a whim, I belong to two choirs locally. That'll be another shameless plug. Celebration Singers of Cranford, Triad Vocal Ensemble. Some of you from the area have heard of at least Ginny Johnston. She is pretty big name. She's a maestro, director of Discovery Orchestra. So I've had folks from both choirs, and very often between the two choirs, when we're dealing with some subject matter or texts in songs, I become, at least in Celebration, the poetry dude, meaning that my conductor will have me come up and talk about the lyrics to a piece we were doing where the lyrics come from Shakespeare. Or they're based on a poem by E.E. Cummings. One of our pieces many years ago was I Carry Your Heart With Me. So one thing led to another, and about 20 people or so, I thought it'd be kind of nice to send out a poem. I had no idea that it would be going on for this long, or that it would take on a life of its own, or that people would be clamoring to say things like, if this once we come out of this pandemic, whatever that, we're still in it, by the way, whenever we come out of it, if you made this into one of my conductors said, if you were to make this a daily blog, I would subscribe to it, which sort of planted a seed now that I don't think I'm ever going to be able to stop doing it. So
I will let
if you wanna know more about it, Phyllis can get you on the thread. Again, but something I would ask that you give some thought to, because you are going to get a poem then every single morning, and there's a setup and there's a poem, and then very often there's a clip or a link. Today we had a wonderful Billy Collins poem. Sometimes there's not, but some people have joined and said, listen, I'm so behind in the daily poem, I just have to sign off a little bit, which is fine. But if you're interested, let Phyllis know. It's now expanded to people I do this sort of thing with, and a couple of colleagues and students. Now there's about 50 people, and we're coming up on a year on March 23rd. And it's a little bit of everything. So we have certain things we do. So as you can see, I love poetry. And for me, it's become part of my, I guess, my psychological and spiritual therapy getting through the pandemic. I've been fortunate. I haven't been sick. I think we're going to have to just mute a few, if you folks, if you can mute yourselves or until it's time to speak, because we have a lot of feedback. But yeah, well, so enough about that, enough of the public service announcement. I've enjoyed doing it. Yes, it is a lot of work, but again, it's kind of, if I don't have the daily poem to send out every morning, sometimes I set it up with a timer if I want to sleep in, but 6:30 or so, people find it on their inbox. It's become something that I think is just, as I said, it's become something that has gone far beyond its original purpose, and I'm grateful for that. But today we're here to talk about. So is that it? Am I good to go?
No, I'm going to say.
Oh, okay.
Thank you. You're brilliant, and you always add so much to our education as well. What a wonderful gift you give us. So now it gives me great pleasure to introduce to you our wonderful friend and guest, John Wargacki, who will speak today on Lyrics of Liberty. Okay.
Lyrics of Liberty. So thank you very much, Phyllis. Phyllis always, I think I love her introductions, and I brag about them to my girlfriend. One day she'll get to hear one of these. Usually she's a nurse at Trinitas Hospital, and Friday afternoons are tough. This is usually not her off day, but one day she'll make it to one of these things and get to hear Phyllis. She already knows all about Phyllis. And when Phyllis writes back to the thread, I always share it with Teresa. And by the way, just one more thing about the daily poem. It's not a blog. So if you have something to respond to, occasionally it's okay to, reply to all, but we kind of discourage that only because we don't want everybody every day to get 40 emails. So every now and then, if you have something that's great, and often I get a lot of just one, Phyllis wrote to the group today to say how much she loved Billy Collins. Another friend of mine wrote just to me saying, I love today's poem, and we go from there. But today it's about the lyrics of liberty. So last year, everybody gets a kick out of this. I said we did Love on the Naughty Side 3. So what I thought at first, way back when we first did Love on the Naughty Side 1 for Valentine's Day, it was in person. And I thought, okay, well, maybe this will go over, maybe not. Well, it turned out by popular demand, we're now in Love on the Naughty Side 3. And I wouldn't be surprised if this just continues. This becomes a thing. Because there's a lot of poetry out there, and a lot of it is just on this side of erotic. So we can keep our R rating, and we can have a little fun. Besides,
and it was fun.
It is fun. It is fun. And sometimes, with your permission, I push the envelope, as Phyllis knows. I enjoy doing that. Poetry gives us that luxury. The poetry today also speaks to the time we're living in. I think poetry has been a part of everything. If you are a person from any religious tradition, our sacred texts are often comprised of poems. I often talk, just recently in my Journey of Transformation class, which is a text that kind of surveys everything from church documents from the Vatican Council to contemporary. This is what's considered a modern text in this class. Dickens' The Christmas Carol is a modern text written in 1843, because we start with the Hebrew Bible. And we go to the Christian Bible, and we do St. Augustine, and we do Plato. So that's, Dickens is on this side of modern. But the reason I mention that is because I talk about the six-day creation story as a kind of poem, right? It has a beginning, right? It sounds right. In the beginning, God speaks everything. And it always ends with evening came and morning followed, or whatever your translation says. So there's a rhythm to it. And
yeah.
Yes,
But I'm
yes. So anyway, the reason I mention this is because I think today, I don't know how many people. I think I'm speaking in a place where I can say this kind of thing. It was very heartening for me yesterday. And whatever your politics are, I have complete respect. That is one of the wonderful things about living in America, is that we get to say what we really think, and we shouldn't have to be fearful of that. So if with anything I say you disagree with, I respect that, but also we should allow people to say what they need to say. So I was very heartened yesterday to see the president speaking on day 51 about how far we've come in 51 days. And like many of you on this thread, I was heartbroken and devastated by what I saw on the television on 1/6, which is kind of 1/6 and 9/11 are being talked about in the same space. And I don't think that's a stretch, frankly. Domestic terrorism is as big and real and scary as international terrorism. So today we talk about the lyrics of liberty. And that's become kind of a really loaded term. It's almost like you have to be careful. I hear people on both sides of the political spectrum talking about freedom and individual liberties and rights and things of that sort. But I think so many great poems and so many of our texts, even if they're not technically poems, I think of them as sometimes prosified poems, speak to this idea of what do we really mean when we talk about liberty? And is it, as I say to my students, is liberty license to do anything we want? And of course it's not. One of the ways we protect our liberty is by playing by the rules and remembering that, I'm a big fan of, how many of you are fans? You could just raise your hand. You don't have to unmute. If you have a hand raising icon, I'm kind of using mine right now. You can go like this. You could put a little thumbs up. If you don't know how to do it, that's fine. I'm a big fan of Hegel, and I'm a big fan of Immanuel Kant. And Kant famously said, with no religious impetus behind it, some of you have learned about in school, the categorical imperative, about how we do the right thing because we agree that's what we're supposed to do. It's for the common good, the benefit of everyone. So I think liberty on one hand can be about, what I'm allowed to do and what I'm allowed to express, but it also means having a sense of a common consciousness, if that makes sense, knowing what that's all about. So we're going to start today by reaching back a little bit, and we're going to talk about the incredible liberty that was experienced by one of our most amazing and earliest poets. Her name was Phyllis Wheatley. Some of you have read Phyllis Wheatley. You've heard of Phyllis Wheatley. If you don't know about Phyllis Wheatley, I'll give you a quick summary. We're going to really talk about text today, not so much about the authors. Phyllis Wheatley was an African-American woman who was not born Phyllis Wheatley, but she became Phyllis Wheatley because she was, I'm so sorry to use terms like this, but I have no other language to borrow from, purchased by the Wheatley family at about the time she was 7. She lived in the Wheatley household. She was a slave. And, but unlike the experience of virtually everyone else under the, insidious institution of slavery, Phyllis Wheatley had an unusual experience. Mrs. Wheatley, you might say her mistress, encouraged her with her education. So she not only became an excellent writer, an orator, and I don't know, she really didn't have many opportunities to speak like Frederick Douglass would later on, but she also became a poet. And she was also schooled in classicism. So she knew her Latin, she knew her Greek, she knew a little bit of Hebrew. And she not only becomes one of the most important poets in the American tradition, albeit as a slave. She never got her freedom. She would eventually get married and have children and so forth. But she also engages the issues of her day. Now, it's important to keep in mind that the Wheatley household was a Puritan household in Boston. And some of you, if you remember, or you're part of a Protestant tradition, you know that the Puritans, once upon a time, believed that we were all part of an elect system. We were saved or we were damned. And God had this all figured out ahead of time. And really, you had nothing to do with it. Your life, the way you lived your life, was a reflection. So it may sound a little strange today, especially when we are living not only in a post-civil rights era, but now more than ever, we're immersed in conversations about things like Black Lives Matter, which is so important. But it's very difficult for us to think back to the 18th century, where a woman of color is writing a poem to General Washington, who was a slave owner, about, yes, you must continue in fighting this war for our independence. So that may be a little strange, but you have to remember, in the context she was raised, this all made sense. Phyllis Wheatley writes a great deal about virtue, and she writes about her Puritan heritage, and from the point of view of feeling as though I am among the elect, I am among the chosen, and it was the mercy of God that brought me over here to know about all this. But again, she's often criticized, I think unfairly, because she doesn't engage slavery at the time. That was a very hard thing for somebody who was in the condition of slavery to do in the 18th century, especially when her household treated her much more like a family member than she was not exposed to some of the horrible, horrible treatments of slaves as we're familiar with now. So I'd like to kind of read through this. It's a bit of a long poem. Some of the language seems a little bit strange because it isn't a neoclassical style of writing. But I think the most important thing is to remember the title, To His Excellency General Washington. And you'll see at the end that Washington actually replied to the poem she wrote. So if you can kind of make the mental shift, and if for those who have seen either on Broadway before it closed or through Disney, Hamilton, we understand today that we can render the story of the founding fathers and the revolution through a very different lens, through the lens of multiculturalism and diversity, and not just the proverbial, all white men doing their thing once upon a time. That's one of the things that I will forever be grateful for with Lin-Manuel Miranda, that he has been able to do as a teacher of American literature. So would somebody like to read for us? It's hard to kind of break it into stanzas. So I would say if somebody could read up to Olive and Laurel binds her golden hair, up to that colon. And then actually, no, go to Grace's rise. There's a period. And we'll talk about that. And then we'll go from there. So she starts off with a lot of mixing of ancient mythology, which is very common for neoclassicists, and Christian imagery, which is not uncommon for another Puritan you've all heard of, John Milton in Paradise Lost, and virtually everything else he writes. So would anybody like to read, Phyllis, or let Phyllis or Michael call on somebody, because I
don't see people. I don't. Michael could.
Michael, if you could see anybody who volunteers to read, that'd be great.
Can you make the poem bigger? I only have half a screen.
You might need to change your view then, because it should be the whole screen.
Oh, should it?
Yeah, I mean, it's not filling my screen, but I could see it. Well, I mean, I'll read it if no one else can. Can anybody see it well enough to read? Celestial choir enthroned in realms of light. Ah, Michael works the magic.
You did it.
Yes.
Okay.
Myra,
I
go
can
ahead.
read it. Okay.
Anytime.
Okay. Sorry. I just till Grace's rise. Is that where you want me to end?
Yeah.
Okay.
We can stop there, because if we do the whole poem, it's too much to talk about in one shot.
Okay. Celestial choir, enthroned in realms of light, Columbia's scenes of glorious toils I write. While freedom's cause her anxious breast alarms, she flashes dreadful and refulgent arms. See Mother Earth her offspring's fate bemoan, and nations gaze at scenes before unknown. See the bright beams of heaven's revolving light, involved in sorrows and the veil of night. The goddess comes, she moves divinely fair. Olive and laurel binds her golden hair. Wherever shines this native of the skies, unnumbered charms and recent graces rise.
Thank you, Myra. So we'll take the next part in just a second, but a couple of words about this. So she's writing this, even though it's obviously it has one person in mind, General Washington, and she was quite aware of General Washington, as everybody was at the time. General Washington was leading us in the midst of the American Revolution. And as I often say to students in class, if there was a place called Las Vegas at the time, and you're somebody who liked to gamble, you would not have bet on the colonists to defeat the mightiest empire since the Romans. That was not a good bet. But so she's basically writing this as a kind of like, go get him, George Washington. But you notice up to where Myra read, there's not a word about Washington, but it will address him more directly. Right now, what she's doing is she's kind of in view, and a lot of these poets are doing at the time. She's invoking the muses, to inspire her. And she's calling upon, the celestial choir, angels and inspirations who are enthroned in realms of light. Columbia's scenes of glorious toils I write. Now, pray tell, who can tell me if you know? Again, we'll just, if anybody can see hands raised or something like that. What is, probably, maybe I'm making it too mysterious. What's Columbia?
Of the ocean.
America.
Columbia at this time is interchangeable with the United States of America. Well, there is no United States of America yet, but at one point, America, which was, we probably learned in grade school, misnamed for Amerigo Vespucci. Columbia becomes the country in South America, and it becomes a city in Ohio. and it becomes the name of a space shuttle. But at this time, Columbia and America, in terms of the culture, were in a competition to see who's going to get the name. So it's not unusual to see America and Columbia used interchangeably, because she's talking about America, right? Of glorious toils I write. And she's saying, basically, we have a lot of poetry to do, so I'm going to move a little faster here. See Mother Earth, her offspring's fate bemoan, meaning all the people of the earth, and nations gaze at scenes before unknown. See the bright beams of heaven revolving light, involved in sorrows and the veil of night. She's basically talking about the revolution. And she's, like a lot of people, she's very well aware through her family. There's no internet, there's no New York Times, there's no cable news, probably a good thing. But she's very well aware that we are in a struggle and we're in a battle for independence that the world has never seen before. Again, for those who have seen Hamilton, after the revolution, that wonderful song, "And the World Turned Upside Down," that's what she's talking about. She's saying, the nations are watching. History has its eyes on us. And so she's invoking all of that imagery even before she gets to her subject, which is really cool. So could somebody take it here? So now she gets right to the point. Muse, by the way, as some of you know, muse is an apostrophe. We don't expect the muse to say, "Hey, I'm listening. What do you want?" Like my dog or cat, right? But she's saying muse, like, listen to me. Who could take it from there up to, in bright array, they seek the work of war? I mean, I'm happy to go back to Myra or somebody who's read before, but if we have new readers, it's great to hear new voices. Muse, thou propitious, while my pen relates.
How pour her armies through 1,000 gates, as when Aeolus heaven's fair face deforms, enwrapped in tempest and a night of storms. Astonished ocean feels the wild uproar, the refluent surges beat the sounding shore, or thick as leaves in autumn's golden rain, such and so many moves the warrior's train. In bright array they seek the work of war, where high unfurled the ensign waves in air.
Okay, what's up there? What's up there, Tanya? Thank you so much. We don't get to hear the word refluent all that much. We don't use it much anymore. It's exactly what it sounds. It comes from fluent, right? So the refluent, like the constant flow of something. So she's invoking the muse, and you could see that she's basically really still talking about how it seems like armies are at war. And nature is always at this time is in syncopation. Not syncopation is the wrong word musically, but their nature, with the doings of man and the doing of nature, are mirroring each other. And it's as thick as the leaves in autumn's golden rain. Like, so much is going on. And then you notice that line, which may strike as an odd. In bright array, they seek the work of war. It's basically, she's using a lot of, again, mythology, and she's also using natural imagery to make her point. By the way, if I didn't point this out, she's writing in what we call heroic couplets, iambic pentameter, and you have uproar, shore, rain, train. War would rhyme more with air at this time. Recite, fight. So let's continue on, because I'm mindful it's almost 1:30 and we're still in the first poem. Could somebody else take it? How about we take it from here to the end? And it's a little bit longer, but we can talk about it in a more coordinated way. So just where Tanya left off. Now she gets right to it, right? Shall I say to Washington, their praise recite? Remember, Washington is not the name of our capital yet. It's the name of this general who will be the first president. How about somebody take it from there, please?
I'll read it.
Thank you.
Shall I to Washington their praise recite? Enough thou knowest them in the fields of fight. Thee, first in place and honors we demand, the grace and glory of thy martial band. Famed for thy valor, for thy virtues more, hear every tongue thy guardian aid implore. 1 century scare performed its destinies round, when Gaelic powers Columbia's fury found. And so may you, whoever dares disgrace the land of freedom's heaven-defended race. Fixed are the eyes of nations on the scales, for their hopes Columbia's arms prevail. And on Britannia droops the pensive head, while round increase the rising hills of dead. Ah, cruel blindness to Columbia's state. Lament thy thirst of boundless power too late. Proceed, great chief, with virtue on thy side. Thy every action let the goddess guide. A crown, a mansion, and a throne that shine, with gold unfading, Washington, be thine.
Okay, thank you so
Wow.
much. Yeah, it's pretty powerful stuff, right?
Right.
And again, when you think about the context of this poem, this is an African-American woman, a slave of the Wheatleys, writing this to General Washington, because she's not thinking in terms of her institutional condition and what the rest of the institution is going on. She's focused here on something that she feels as though, and again, I don't think she's writing from the point of view like, we win this war and I'll be free, because frankly, the progenitor of her poetry, one of the reasons we're reading this today is not just because Phyllis Wheatley wrote it, it's because Mrs. Wheatley wanted her to write poetry, and she became sort of her editor and also became the facilitator. I mean, Phyllis Wheatley could not go into the world, even in Boston, and publish her poetry, but Mrs. Wheatley could. But see, so there was kind of a different situation, a different condition that we have to kind of immerse ourselves in that context in order to understand this. So again, she's talking, there's a couple of lines here, you know, Columbia, interchange. She's not talking about Britain, but Britannia, right? Anon Britannia droops the pensive head. She's saying fixed are the eyes of nations on the scales. Like the outcome of this is going to have repercussions for everyone. And sure enough, who's going to follow? The French. And they're, you know, still, they're going to have a pretty bloody 19th century because of what we started, because we kind of showed the way. But she keeps referring to General Washington, you know, for in their hopes, meaning, you know, what they want, Columbia's arm prevail. Like, we have to take the lead. We have to show the way. While round increase the rising hills of dead. So we know this is a costly war. We know men are dying in the battlefields. Ah, cruel blindness to Columbia's state. Lament thy thirst of boundless power too late. So here at the end, in the last 4 lines, and then we'll move on to his response. Washington, as you may have guessed, is the great chief. She's using that indigenous term and she's applying it to Washington. She's like, basically saying, you go, George, you go, keep at it. Don't be discouraged. Proceed, great chief. She doesn't say God. She doesn't say might makes right, with virtue on thy side. I didn't have time to do it today. They're both too long. If you read this poem and you read it next to Thomas Paine's I'm sorry, I'm messing this up. I don't have I'm a little bit older now. It's actually a poem by Phyllis Wheatley. I mean, not Phyllis Wheatley, Philip Freneau, the other great patriotic poet of the time. And Freneau writes a poem called about Thomas Paine, called, you know, on Thomas Paine's Rights of Man. If you read those 2 poems together, it's eerie how close they are in what they're saying. Except in Freneau's poem, he's saying Thomas Paine was right, and kings, tyrants are gone, and a new age is in. And he also uses the phrase Columbia. Here, similarly, saying, proceed, great chief, with virtue on thy side, meaning you've got right on your side. This is a virtuous cause. Let every action, let the goddess guide, because virtue was considered not just a moral condition. Virtue was a goddess. Virtue was depicted, right? Like in ancient mythology, a crown, a mansion, and a throne that shine. Now, of course, we're not talking about a king here, but with gold unfading, Washington be thine. So she imagines Washington, if you persevere and we win this war, you get a crown, you get a mansion, and you get a throne, all of which Washington is going to say, no, thank you. We didn't fight this war to make me the new king. But at the time, that seemed to be okay. Like, we'll get rid of King George and George Washington. So again, famous scene from Hamilton. It's like, it's time for me to go. It's time for me to step aside so I can pave the way. I do not want a third term. And so we see what happened here. This is an amazing poem. Structurally, it's absolutely, it's an amazing piece of work. And it also speaks to what Phyllis Wheatley feels in all of her heart in the moment, which is very emotional. There's a lot of emotion in this about, if Washington wins this war, liberty succeeds. Now, again, some of that could be because since the age of 7, this is what's kind of been breathed into her in the Wheatley household. But at the same time, I think it's ideas that she has genuinely come to own at this point in her career. So any thoughts about that at all? Or we have time for a couple quick comments? Of course, I'll save time at the end for some more general ideas about anything.
She had to be a brilliant woman.
Oh, she was.
I mean,
she had
her
his
language, her vocabulary. I mean,
one of the great ironies of Phyllis Wheatley is, for a woman, a Black woman in a condition of slavery, she had a better education than most other white women of the time because of Mrs. Wheatley. Most of the women at the time were what they call, like John Adams's wife, Abigail, she was what they called homeschooled. Now, Phyllis Wheatley didn't go to college. College at this time, only men went to college. And at the time, if you're going to college, you're probably going to be a minister. But she was homeschooled. And she was homeschooled with the classics. In fact, to be fair, Thomas Jefferson, and say what we will about Thomas Jefferson, there's a lot we can say. Thomas Jefferson read these poems, didn't believe she wrote them. But here's another interesting fact about Phyllis Wheatley. At a very important time in the next century after she's dead, when there's a huge conversation about, are people of color inferior? Her poetry was used as evidence that that is nonsense. So even though she's criticized for not speaking about slavery, which I think in the context would have been very difficult for her to do, at the same time, it's ironic that after her death, what Phyllis said, she's brilliant. Her brilliance is actually making the case that says, no, this stuff about, being superior, inferior is absolutely ridiculous. And the complexity of her verse was the evidence. So thank you. Should we go to General Washington's response?
yes.
Let's see what the general has to say. I'm sorry for all the Hamilton references. I know that not everybody has seen it. So maybe I'll just read this in the interest of time. I'm going to see if I can move this out here. Okay, yeah. So this is dated, remember, look at the date here, February 2nd, 1776, right? You notice something interesting about this date? We're months away from the Declaration of Independence.
Right.
The war hasn't even started yet. There's no war until this Declaration of Independence. But enough of the history lesson. We're here to talk about poetry, right? Miss Wheatley, your favor of the 26th October did not reach my hands till the middle of December. The good old postal service that Ben Franklin was slow even at this time. So the way it goes. With all due respect, I love the post office, and I love Benjamin Franklin, but he's a story for another day. Time enough. You will say to have given an answer ere this, granted, but a variety of important occurrences continually imposing to distract the mind and withdraw the attention, I hope will apologize for the delay. Washington's apologizing to Wheatley, saying, I'm sorry, I've been kind of busy. I wish I got this poem in the middle of December, but I'm only now having time to write. I have a couple of those emails I'm waiting to write right now. And plead my excuse for not seeming, but not real neglect. In other words, it wasn't out of neglect. It was just, life gets in the way. I thank you most sincerely for your polite notice of me. By the way, Washington there's no doubt in anybody's mind that Washington knows exactly to whom he's writing. This is not a mystery. He's not thinking Phyllis Wheatley is some woman from Boston who's living the life. He knows exactly to whom he's writing. And it's a beautiful response. I thank you sincerely in the elegant lines you enclosed, and however undeserving I may be of such encomium and panegyric, a style and manner exhibit, a striking proof of your poetical talents, in honor of which, and as a tribute justly due to you, I would have published the poem had I not been apprehensive that while I only meant to give the world this new instance of your genius, I might have incurred the imputation of vanity, meaning I didn't want to presume to publish your poetry. Some of you remember that happened to Anne Bradstreet. Her brother-in-law published her poetry. She was not happy that he did that without her permission. So these things happen. Anyway, this and nothing else determined me not to give it a place in the public prints. If you should ever come to Cambridge, our near headquarters, I shall be happy to see a person so favored by the muses and to whom nature has been so liberal and beneficent in her dispensations. I am, with great respect, your obedient, humble servant, George Washington. Notice that George Washington, not President Washington, not General Washington, that hasn't happened yet. But he is genuinely taken by this. And by the way, if you think this is a little bit over the top, this is kind of almost like patronizing. If you read letters at this time, this is how these letters are written. This is how John Adams writes to his wife. This is how Abigail writes to John Adams. This is how Jefferson wrote to Adams. This is how Franklin wrote to the King of France. This is the style. And it's always with the, I beseech and beg your honor and yada, yada, and it goes on and on. Because, one of the things I think is very sad today about technology and emails and so forth is that we're losing the art of the handwritten or hand-typed letter. I remember being, when I was in college back in the 80s, my history professor, long before there was this thing called the internet, said, what are letters? Primary artifacts of history. They are the primary, and now we call the newspaper, whether it's in electronically or the media, we call it the first draft of history. But I wonder what will come of the next generation who doesn't have because you don't get emails that sound like this, right?
No.
Everything has everything abbreviated and everything's an acronym, and I'm beginning to sound my age, so I will shut up now. I think it's a wonderful poem. I think George Washington's reply is indeed sincere. Let's go to Walt Whitman. Let's skip ahead about almost 100 years, right? Will somebody read? I actually recited this dressed as Whitman about 2 Novembers ago in a show called A Feast of American Music for around Thanksgiving. I'm going to be really self-indulgent here. I don't know if you can see this. That's me as Whitman with my girlfriend, the nurse.
Beautiful.
And she is dressed as a 19th century nurse. We got that outfit online. We found it. Who is selling it? What's the outfit that sells? Amazon. 19th century. So here I am as Walt Whitman, and this is what I recited for the group. Most of it was music. The first time in a long time I've been on stage and I didn't sing. Tracy, please read all of I Hear America Singing by Mr. Whitman, which is a grand middle of 19th century celebration of our diversity.
I Hear America Singing The very carols here, those mechanics, each one singing his as it should be, blithe and strong. The carpenter singing his as he measures his plank or beam. The mason singing his as he makes ready for work or leaves off work. The boatman singing what belongs to him in his boat, and deckhand singing on the steamboat deck. The shoemaker singing as he sits on his bench. The hatter singing as he stands. The woodcutter's song, the plowboy's on his way in the morning, or at noon intermission, or at sundown. The delicious singing of the mother, or of the young wife at work, or of the girl sewing or washing, each singing what belongs to him or her and to no one else. The day, what belongs to the day. At night, the party of young fellows, robust, friendly, singing with open mouths their strong, melodious songs.
Thank you, Tracy. Beautifully done, beautifully read. One of his most famous lines. This has been set to music. This is part of choral pieces. We may see we'll see what we get at the end. Langston Hughes, the great Langston Hughes, actually wrote a reply, I Too Hear America.
Yes.
I Too Hear America singing, where he talked about, the Negro, the Black person of color at the same table, not the one in the kitchen serving, but the one at the table alongside of. And it is in reply to this. But I think Whitman here, in the context of the American Civil War, you notice we don't have the invocation of the muse. We don't have any rhyming. We don't have any iambic pentameter. This is Whitman at Whitman's best. Whitman's letting his hair down. Whitman is letting it all. You can see Whitman, if you can see over my shoulder, there's that long black and white photo etch of Whitman in my office. It's right under my pirate face. And he's got that stance with the head cocked, kind of like, he kind of knows all things, because I think Whitman maybe does. So we go back to the text. I hear America singing, right? This is what we're singing. And it is a song. It is, in a sense, a carol. The varied carols I hear. And you notice that everybody who's mentioned in this text is not somebody who's in a position of power. And they're not in a position of prestige. And they're not somebody with a fancy title. It's the mechanic. It's the carpenter. It's the mason. It's the boatman. It's the shoemaker. It's the person who leaves their home or works from home every day at the time when you went to work in Whitman's time, if you weren't a soldier and you worked from home or you worked on the farm, you left at sunrise. And when did you come home?
Sunset.
At night.
Sundown.
You worked at sundown. And how many days? The students get blown away by this. 6 days. We didn't invent TGIF yet. We didn't have the weekend. Why? 6 days? Well, it came from the Bible. 6 days labor, 1 day rest. And so when students read that, when we're doing Bartleby the Scrivener by Melville, and they said, you mean the law office was open on a Saturday at Wall Street and Scrivener showed up? And I said, yes. And then on Sunday, everything closed. Now, I'm not saying let's go back to those days. I mean, I like my Fridays, all right? But once upon a time, that's what you had to do. But here he's celebrating the labor of all. This is America singing, not taking time off, not in necessarily the choir. And he noticed he covers an array of, most of these professions are folks, men and women, who work with their hands. That's what he's really foregrounding here. It's not necessarily the teacher, although he loves teachers. It's not the priest at the pulpit. It's not the philosopher. It's the mechanic. It's the mason. It's the woodcutter. And then leave it to Whitman. Whitman will not leave the women out of the picture. Whitman is very famous for saying him or her, his or hers. He includes both pronouns before it became a thing. The delicious singing. For him, there was no bigger job and there was no harder job than to be at home and be the mother. For Whitman, that was something that he admired to the point where he was almost envious. Or of the young wife at work, or the girl sewing and washing. And in a wonderful way, he kind of brings us together. He brings us into a crescendo, right? voices, all together, right? Everybody sing, Toto, each singing what belongs, here he goes again, to him or her and no one else. In other words, sing your song. Sing the song of your trade. Sing the song of your identity. And together, those songs will make what? A symphony, a chorus. That's why it's not, I hear America working. It's not, I hear America speaking. I hear America singing. The day, what belongs to the day. And then we get, work is over now, right? Leave it to Whitman. Whitman works both sides of the room with equal measure. What belongs to the day at night, the party of young fellows, robust, friendly, singing with open mouths, their strong, melodious songs. What is it? It's Miller time. The day is over. Some of you remember that, right? It's Miller time. After you've sung your song and you did your work and you mothered the kids, let's go out at night, get the young fellas together, robust and friendly. Let's embrace. We'll be doing that again soon. Hang in there. Singing with open mouth. There's strong melodious song. It comes together, not just one song, melodious songs. So it's kind of like a way of saying we each have our own song, but together they form this mosaic of the American experience, which is why I hear America singing. Wonderful text, wonderful text. Never gets old. So let's continue because I want to, now let's see how this works together. Now it's 1947, almost 100 years later, not quite. I love this poem. This poem to me was written in 1947, but gosh darn it, you know what? After this last year, this poem is as important today as it's ever been, And I think all of us were reminded in very, very harsh ways of how important this poem is. Because what is Langston Hughes doing here? Well, the metaphor of the freedom train. This was a time where people just didn't hop in their cars and go everywhere. We didn't have the elaborate systems of subways yet. They're going to be there soon. When you went from place to place, when you went from state to state, one part of the country to the other, you went on a train. And if you were Black or colored, as was said back then, you were not in the front of the train. It's the whole Rosa Parks story. But let's hear a little bit about this. I think the poem is, it's not short, but it's long enough, not long enough where one person can read the whole poem. Would somebody kindly read it for us, the Freedom Train? Or Freedom Train, there's no the. Please.
I'll read it.
Thank you, Sandra.
Freedom Train. I've read in the papers about the Freedom Train. I heard on the radio about the Freedom Train. I've seen folks talking about the Freedom Train. Lord, I've been awaiting for the Freedom Train. Washington, Richmond, Durham, Chattanooga, Atlanta, way across Georgia. Lord, 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 way down in Dixie, the only trains I see. Got a Jim Crow coaches set aside for me. I hope there ain't no Jim Crow on the Freedom Train. No backdoor entrance to the Freedom Train. No sign for coloreds on the Freedom Train. No white folks only on the Freedom Train. I'm gonna check up. I'm going to check up on this Freedom Train. Who is the engineer on the Freedom Train? Can a cold Black man drive the Freedom Train? Or am I still a porter on the Freedom Train? Is there ballot boxes on the Freedom Train? Do colored folks vote on the Freedom Train? When it stops in Mississippi, will it be made plain? Everybody got a right to board the Freedom Train? I'm going to check up. I'm going to check up on this Freedom Train. The Birmingham stations marked colored and white. The white folks go left, the colored go right. They even got a segregated lane. Is that the way to get aboard the Freedom Train? I'm going to check up. I'm going to check up on this Freedom Train. If my children ask me, Daddy, please explain why a Jim Crow stations for the Freedom Train? What shall I tell my children? You tell me, because freedom ain't freedom when a man ain't free. Lost mine. My brother named Jimmy died at Anzio. He died for real and it wasn't no show. Is this here for freedom on a freedom train really freedom on a show again? Now let the freedom train come zooming down a track, gleaming in the sunlight for white and black, not stopping at no stations war-colored nor white, just stopping in the fields in a broad daylight, stopping in a country in the wide open air, where there never was a Jim Crow sign nowhere. Ain't no lily white committees, politicians of note, nor a poll tax layer through which colored can't vote. And there won't be no kind of colored lines. The freedom train will be yours and mine. Then maybe from their graves in Anzio, black men and white will say, we want it so. Black men and white will say, ain't it fine? At home, they got a freedom train that's yours and mine.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Sandra.
Beautiful.
This poem just grabs me. I mean, it just grabs me every time. I've shared this way back when on the Daily Poem. Langston Hughes has certainly been on the Daily Poem lots and lots of times. Langston Hughes is just in a class of his own. I mean, he really is just completely, there's no one quite like him. And I'd say few poets, if any, have achieved so much across the spectrum of the arts. You know, he was an essayist, he was an intellectual, he was born in North Carolina. He was, as he says in my theme for English B, I'm the only colored student in my class, and that the college up on the hill, which we know today as Columbia. And he stayed at the Y across Morningside Park, where he went to do his English homework for his white professor. So he done it all. He actually, and some of you know, he wrote the lyrics to an opera that was written by an all black composer, right? All composers. He loved Porgy and Bess, and he loved Gershwin, but he said, my goodness, why does the first opera with all black characters be written by a white man? And he had a point. He said, Porgy and Bess is great. He goes, but we can do this. We can do this too. And he did. And he did. And it was put on in New York. And you can all look that up. I'm digressing too much. But the man did it all. He did it all. And this poem, you notice it's got a lot of that Whitmanian repetition, and it emphasizes the point. And, you know, he goes, but there's really like three distinct parts to it, right? It's like, I heard about this freedom train, and I'm going to check up on it. I don't know if I believe it. It seems too good to be true. And you notice the freedom train and the segregation and the Jim Crow laws and the separate but equal and all of this nonsense. It's metaphorized in the train, but we don't get that far away from the poll tax and voter suppression, right? Hey, you know, 1947, 1921, 2021, as I say to my black friends on campus, I said to Reverend Pritchard, you know, I've been with the MLK Scholars for years, which I'm so proud of, proud that they asked me to be part of their organization. And I said to Reverend Pritchard, who's now working in the provost's office, I said, Forrest, I said, we're fighting the same battles we fought, and he's a little bit older than me. He goes, John, he goes, welcome to my world. He said, welcome to mine. He's very polite about it. He said, this is new stuff for you, that you fight the battle, you win the battle, and 5 years, 10 years later, guess what? We're fighting it all over again. That's what we do. So I think today in 2021, we have this question, this poem raises questions for us all. Where's that freedom train? Do we still have a freedom train? Right now, we know that there's legislatures, state legislatures, trying to suppress the vote. And we know what that is. We know what that is. It's not about legitimate voting. It's exactly what Langston Hughes is talking about here. It just has a different name. So I think we know what we've got to do. And I love his line. What really gets me is my brother died at Anzio. And most of you know that's the battlefield in Italy. And what is he saying by that, really? He's saying, my black brother died next to the same white soldiers. The same bullets killed the black soldiers as killed the white soldiers. So why do I have to go to the back of the train? It's a question Ralph Ellison asked. It's a question that we ask all of the writers today. Then maybe from their graves in Anzio, black men and white will say, we want it so. Like, that's what we have to have. We have to have both sides agreeing this is what we want, because one side alone is not going to make it work. Black men and white will say, ain't it fine? At home, they got a freedom train that's yours and mine. So it's a beautiful poem.
Oh, it
It
is.
just flows. By the way, if you want, for those of you who do this kind of thing, you can find YouTube clips of Langston Hughes reading this poem. You won't see him, but you'll hear him. You'll hear that distinctive voice with that little North Carolinian accent reading the Freedom Train. So yes, let's continue on. I know we're running out of time. Thank you, Sandra. Beautifully done. So we're going to end with really two prosified poems, and I hold them in relationship to one another. One was June 10th, 1963, and the other was April 3rd. I just used this the other. I was leading a book club. Phyllis, by the way, you're on the list. You're going to be getting the story in the mail. I talked to my friend.
Thank you.
Lee. Yes,
Thank you.
I just wanted to mention that because I'm going to forget later. So you'll be getting something in the mail. I used this Dr. King speak. And why? I'm going to start with Dr. King. I'm going to read him last, but I want to say something about Dr. King first, because most of us know this was done, this end of this long speech, which we teach now at Seton Hall. All the freshmen have to read this speech. I've been to the mountaintop. And this is the very end. And he's reading, this is the last speech he'll ever give. And it's the night before he was killed. Literally the night before he was killed in Memphis. That's why he references Memphis here. And it was something he did, there's a whole story to it, but if I get into the story, I'm going to lose my traction here. But I want you to see how kind of what President Kennedy is saying. This is an address, not an inaugural speech. Everybody talks about, and I love this, Kennedy's famous line from that inaugural speech, right? Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask rather what you can do for your country. You know why that line's so memorable? It's not because it's a great line. It's because he framed it in a classical rhetoric. It's almost like came from the Bible. Nobody in 1961 was talking like that. Ask not. That's like something from the Bible. And the Lord saith, that's why it's so memorable. No one would remember it if Kennedy said, stop asking what your country can do for you. Start asking what you can do for you. That's the way they'd say it today. But Kennedy said that, ask not, right? The measuring. But this is not that speech. This was given at American University on June 10th. And it's at the end, he's talking about communism. He's talking about the threat of the Soviet Union. He's talking about, we're around just after the missile crisis, right? And this is some of his most famous words, some of the most famous language. And I'm just going to read the first one, and then someone else could read Dr. King. And I want to see how they speak to the same ideas in the same frame. You know what? They're both, without using the actual word, they're both about their dreams. They're both about what we can aspire to, not who we are, but who we can be if we really want to, if we really make the effort. So President Kennedy said, so let us not be blind. There's another phrase, like very Latin. Let us not be blind to our differences, right? I won't do it as Kennedy. I do a good Kennedy, but I'm not gonna impersonate him. But let us also direct attention to our common interests, and by the means by which those differences can be resolved. If we cannot end now our differences, at least we can help make the world safe for diversity. For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's futures, and we are all mortal. Make the world safe. I love this, because you know what's not in this end of the speech? Now, he does talk about America in his speech, and he does talk about the Cold War. Let's be fair about that. But he doesn't mention, there's no mention of America. We're not making the world safe for democracy. We're not making it America first. We make the world safe for what? Diversity. Diversity for everyone. Because at the end of the day, President Kennedy realized that most basic thing. His Irish Catholic heritage taught him this, that beneath the prejudice, beneath the indifference, beneath the religious intolerance, beneath the ideology, we're all human. We're all on this little planet. We breathe the same air. We all want exactly the same thing. We want our children's lives to be good. Cherish our children's futures. And we're all mortal. We're all going to shuffle off this mortal coil, as Shakespeare said. Let's hear how Dr. King kind of speaks to this just 5 years later. Could somebody just read that? This is at the very end. This is the last, but this is the crescendo. But again, that's really all we have time for. Now we'll wrap it up. Anybody, a new reader or even somebody who's read, all good to me?
I'll read it if no one else wants to.
Please, by all means. Thank you, Tracy.
Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead, but it really doesn't matter now with me now, because I've been to the mountaintop and I don't mind, like anybody. I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place, but I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain, and I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. I am so happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
Amen. I don't know what else to say after this except amen. It's a prayer, it's a poem, it's a hymn, it's a psalm. And my goodness, it kind of, the connection between those two sentiments, President Kennedy, Dr. King, it all reaching for that same goal. But the difference with Dr. King, which I really love, is that he famously said, the moral arc of history is long, but it bends toward where?
Justice.
Does anybody know the end?
Justice.
Justice. He is certain that too comes from his Christian Protestant roots, and it's all in the Judeo-Christian tradition. So it's not just the Judeo-Christian tradition go together, but it's that idea. Where does the promised land come from, if not the Exodus? Where does the idea of the promised land come from, except, the Jewish Bible, right? I've seen the promise. Like Moses, I could see it. I may not get there with you. He says that. I may not get there with you. But I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. He is really speaking now as a prophet. And I don't think I can't imagine what was going through that dear man's head at the time. But man, to think that he would not live to see the next day, that morning he would be shot on that balcony, sadly. But he says, I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. The opening lines of the Battle Hymn of the Republic. So I think that kind of puts, these are the lyrics of liberty, folks. This is what it is. From the African-American slave in the 18th century to Dr. King, who has seen the promised land. It is a very, very powerful story. And there's so many texts we didn't get to. And so it was hard to put a program together because I didn't know what to leave out. But I wanted to give you a smorgasbord of everything. So I'm open to comments, questions. I'll hang out for a little bit. But it's been, I'm always inspired after these presentations, because I feel seeing all your faces out there, even on Zoom, I'm inspired that we're going to get to the promised land. We just got to keep doing the next right thing.
You have inspired all of us, in case we need to hear a voice like yours. And it was wonderful. Everything you said was so brilliant, and the poems were phenomenal. And I think about with Martin Luther King. In 1992, I got the award in South Orange, so Martin Luther King Award, and it's hanging in the library. But in any case, I
How
think
wonderful.
in retrospect, when he wrote "I Won't See It," I think that unfortunately he was threatened so much that it was just a matter of time. And unfortunately, what we're seeing now is anyone who speaks out, if people are afraid to go into the Capitol, who work there, this fear that no one can protect them. But it doesn't matter, because what their work is more important than canceling out.
I agree.
So
I agree.
you were
Yes.
absolutely. I
Well,
loved
thank you.
all of everything that you did, and I hope everyone else did too. You are a gift to us.
Thank you so much, John. It was,
So if you haven't left yet, anybody has a comment or question, I'm here.
I have a question about the Whitley poem.
Wheatley? Yeah.
Wheatley, sorry. How old was she? Do you know when she wrote it? Or what stage of life?
I would honestly, I'd have to look that up, but if he got it in, she writes it obviously in 1775 because he gets it in December, and he's writing back to her in February of 76. So, unfortunately, my the text I'm using right now that has Wheatley in it is in my car, because I have to keep all my books in my car because I go right to the class from my car. I don't stop in my office, because of high flex teaching, but that's easy to look up. I'm going to take a wild guess and say she was probably in her 30s or 40s when she wrote that. I could probably
John,
pull a book off the shelf, but
John, I just looked it up. She was only 31 when she died.
oh, she was only 31 when
wow.
she died. Okay, thank you, Michael. Thank you.
Michael's
Right, that's
great.
right. She did have a shorter life. So, Michael, do you know how old she would have been about like 1775, since you have it there?
Maybe 22.
22. So that's
Oh my
something.
God.
I think nowadays, thank you, Michael. That's something my colleague, Dr. Mary Balkin, my former chairman office mate, Mary Balkin, that's her. She's the colonialist. I pick up with Whitman, but we get into our silos. So if you ask me how old Whitman was when he wrote this, I got it like right there, but I got to look that other thing up. But thank you, Michael. That's good to know. Right. And I just did something on Wheatley, so I should have known that. But, we sometimes, it's an interesting thing. Today, like we're looking at Amanda Gorman, who spoke at the, she read the poem at the
Yes,
inauguration.
fabulous. Yeah.
Everybody, I was saying this to my friends, and she's the first national youth poet laureate, and she was 22, right? She just turned 23 in March. But remember, just think for a moment, especially to this group. When I was 22, I felt like a real man. I didn't feel like a kid anymore. Like I was engaged. I had to buy a house. I was working in the legislature. I was going to Trenton. I was writing speeches. And I wasn't saying like I was so cool. I'm saying, right, when you were 22 and 23, you were like, you're living this life. You're already on it. Today we think, I don't know, for whatever reason, the culture has changed. We think of 22, it's like you're 16. But you're really especially at that time. So I think a lot's changed. I know, like, when my father was 22, he'd already fought in a war. You're just getting home from the Philippines and marrying my mother. So I think we have to make that different shift. And I'd say, folks, Amanda Gorman is not a kid. She's a mature woman. So, yeah, I think that we have to make that shift sometime. But thank you, Michael. I appreciate that information, because it's on my shelf, but I'm on earbuds, and I can't disconnect. Any other thoughts or comments at all?
yeah, I have a question.
Yeah, Tracy.
Yeah. So I see you've come into the 40s with Langston Hughes, and then into the 60s with Dr. King. Do you teach anything that relates to the freedom poets, the radical revolutionary poets like Gil Scott-Heron and Amir Baraka, those of that?
Yeah, in fact, I do. In fact, I'm actually teaching modern American poetry right now. So the scope of that course begins with the 20th century, and I start with a poet. Some of you know this name, Paul Laurence Dunbar.
Mhm,
And Paul Laurence Dunbar was the son of slaves. And he begins in the 19th century and goes into the 20th. He didn't live very long either. I think he died in his 30s. So I start with him, and we're going to end with the folks you mentioned, as well as Rita Dove and Lucille Clifton and Major Jackson, who I think is amazing. In fact, we just recently did something. Rita Dove is the editor of the anthology I'm using. So I knew I picked a winner. So yes, we are doing the Freedom Poets. We're doing a little bit of everything. And I think this is probably, for some of the more obvious reasons, I'd like to think my syllabus was always like this, but I think this is probably this semester, spring of 2021, about as diverse and widespread a syllabus as I've ever used. I'm using Joy Harjo. Joy Harjo is a Native American poet, and she's absolutely incredible. So yes, I do all, I know. So unfortunately, like you have to put the brakes on somewhere. So I said, if I'm gonna start with Phyllis Wheatley, I'll get you up to the 1960s. We could do a whole, next time we do Lyrics of Liberty, we can do a whole show on the Freedom Poets.
Yeah.
I would love to do that. That would be awesome. And as
You
Phyllis
are
will tell
awesome.
you, as
I-
Phyllis will tell you, there's no shortage of diversity on the Daily Poem.
Right, right.
We hit all cylinders.
Could I add something, John?
Yes, of course.
I really loved your the poets that you chose, but I really have a little bit of Washington stuck in my throat. He was a slaveholder.
Yeah.
And I'm sure you know the book Never Caught, about the runaway slave and how he relentlessly chased after what he thought was his property.
Right.
You know,
Right.
so.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I'll be brutally honest, until, and again, it's kind of like one of the reasons I'm so grateful to Lin-Manuel is that until Hamilton came out, I had a very hard time teaching the American Lit 1 survey, because it was hard to create a context in which you have these folks like John Adams and Abigail, who never owned a slave, as famously documented in David McCullough's biography. And they got into, Adams got into these rough and tumble arguments about the immorality of slavery with Jefferson. And Jefferson, the weird thing about Jefferson, and he's so complex, is that he agrees with Adams. But then he also says, well, if I freed all my slaves tomorrow, what would happen? What kind of lives would they have? So it's very hard sometimes, and I'm not saying this as a old white guy being an apologist. I think I have to be frank and say, if I grew up in this 18th century, I really don't know what my ideas would be, because so much would depend on the family I was raised in and the education I had and the culture I was in. And I'm not saying it makes it right. I'm just saying, like at the same time, if I was raised a Catholic before Vatican II, I would probably belong to a different religion right now. So I think sometimes I have to say, well, my parents stuck with the church even before they got hip. And they were overly church is never free of problems, believe me. We know that. But, the arc from Once Upon a Time to Francis is a long one. So I totally agree with you. It's hard. It's very, very hard. But again, my students, almost all of them, one of the few times I'll say thank Disney, right? I'm not a big Disney fan, but Disney got Hamilton to us without a $500 ticket. And so most of my students from all the spectrum have seen Hamilton, and they can plug in to the complexity of the time. Some of you know the story when Lin-Manuel Miranda first met Barack Obama, and he had done his first Broadway musical, From the Heights.
In the Heights.
Right? In the Heights, right? So he told him at the time, he said, I'm working on something new, and it's going to be based on a founding father who I think embodies hip hop. And he told President Obama, but President Obama said, well, what founding father? He goes, Alexander Hamilton. And President Obama's reaction at the time was, oh yeah, right. White guy on the $10 bill. Well, look what happened. Look what happened, right? And when you can, it also, what Miranda accomplished in that musical is not just the aesthetic breadth and kind of redeeming the story, if you will, but he leaves us all with a question at the very end. And again, I know this may be an abstraction for some folks if you haven't seen it, but the very end, Hamilton's dead. Hamilton's gone. I'm not spoiling anything. And who gets to tell the rest of the story? His wife, who outlived him by 50 years. And the last thought the musical leaves you with is, who's going to tell your story? Because the person who tells your story really has the control over how you're going to be remembered. So no matter what we do in our lives, good or bad, let's hope that our stories are being told. We leave our stories in the right hands, because again, it's kind of like, I think Miranda saw what the wife had to say about her husband and created a larger narrative than just about Alexander, being an immigrant. So I just think that that's a very, very important point. And it's not one that needs to be sidestepped, but it's also something that creates an interesting conversation in the classroom we need to have.
Mm-hmm.
How do we look at people 300, 400 years later? What does it say today? How does it, what you said, Tanya, how does that speak today even more powerfully to folks who still hold some of those beliefs? Right? It really makes how many people have we heard over the last couple of years and since 2016 talk about this moment in time as an inflection point? It puts a lot more gravitas on this inflection point when we realize that we're not there. The freedom train is still, I want to see it. I'll believe it when I see it. I'm still not sure. But excellent point. But I think it speaks powerfully that that correspondence occurs between Wheatley and Washington, who we know was all the founding fathers. We have, I think when I was a kid, we honored them too much. Maybe the pendulum has swung in the direction of the other way. But I also think that, we have to create a context where we look at, what would I have believed at that time? What would I have done? What if I grew up as a Catholic or a Protestant in Nazi Germany and I wasn't Jewish? What if I grew up in Poland? Would I have been like a lot of Polish people who today are anti-Semitic? Or would I have been like young Karol Wojtyła, who luckily became the John Paul II and reached out to Jews and visited the synagogue in Rome, the first pope to do so? I would like to think I'd be Karol Wojtyła, but I don't know. A lot has to do with who raised us. What did they teach us? I'm only here today because of these folks over my shoulder, mom and dad, who growing up in a Polish Catholic household taught me that we never judge and everyone is a child of God. And I'm the benefactor of that belief. Because not every one of my friends were being taught that, let me tell you. So
well, they should be.
I hope so. Well, we're always trying to, be on the
catch up.
Yeah, we're really trying to catch up, and we're always trying to take another step. I think something Barack Obama said in the last 4 years, he did a lot of public speaking. He made a lot of appearances. He said when he entered the White House on day one, he was so sure of how much he would be able to accomplish, even with a hostile Congress. And almost like by the sheer force of his rhetoric, like, gosh darn it, if I could have been elected president of the United States, I can do this, 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 and this. And when he left the Oval Office, he didn't say, I didn't become cynical. I didn't become pessimistic, but I realized the simple truth. All I could really do was push the subject a little bit farther to the right side. I couldn't change the world, even in 8 years. I couldn't change the country in 8 years, but I could do what I could do with the time I had. And I think that's a valuable lesson. It's kind of what's going to be our legacy. And what do
You
we
do
leave
the-
to our children to do? So,
You do the best you can.
yeah, that's it. That's it. And I think, God bless him, the man did the best. I think right now, President Biden and Vice President Harris are doing the very best they can with every minute they have. I'm at my old age, I'm perennially optimistic.
That's-
You
I,
know,
I hate to be that guy, but
it's time to go.
You'll
Okay,
never
Michael,
interrupt.
it's good
John,
that
you're coming back, of course. You
of
know
course.
that.
Thank you all.
You're
We
wonderful.
definitely need
Thank
that
you
guy in the
again.
room, Michael. So thank you.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you all. I
Thank
actually
you,
have
John.
I have book revisions to work on, but you have been such a wonderful way to spend my Friday. So thank you.
So how do we get on your email list?
Thank you.
Just let Phyllis know and she'll send me your email and I can get you on the daily poem thread, whoever's in. Myra's on it, right?
Yes,
Yes.
Mhm.
So
you have
I just need
changed
the
my
email.
life for the better.
thank you.
Truly. I
That is
went through
very
some
sweet.
difficult times recently, and the poetry in the morning lifted me up. Thank you.
Thank you.
See?
Thank you. Thank you. It's I have my Phyllis knows my Russian friend Nadia. I ask her sometimes, because she's like a little sister. I said, let me know, what are we doing on the daily poem? And she would say, John, she's from Russia, don't change anything. She says, your channel is open. Don't think, just do.
You just have to light one candle.
I swear, it's exactly what she says to me, with this beautiful face and the black hair. So I know we got to go, folks. So thank you all. Be safe.